When we started this show, all we really needed was a laugh. 27 episodes gone by, I'd say we've done pretty well. Welcome to the jungle. Welcome to Convince Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's another week, another episode of your favorite, or at least our favorite podcast, Convince Me. Andy Rutherford here, joined as always by Mr. Casey Elrod, Mr. Brian Bennett. Can't even say your name. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Assume your first part of your opening was some cryptic song lyric from one of these bands we're discussing tonight.
My gosh.
The fact that you don't know what it was already disappoints me before we get started.
I feel like we're going to be taking a walk on the wild side tonight.
Probably. Elrod, hope you got an appetite for destruction because there's quite a bit coming here tonight.
I do know that.
If you guys are picking up what we're laying down, then this is the show for you. But before we get into that, here is your weekly shill. Go follow us on our socials. Facebook.com/ConvinceMeShow. That's our most active social media page. That's where you're going to get the Tuesday night preview of every single episode in the video format. Check us out on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @ConvinceMeShow. Every now and then, we'll throw up a poll. We turn the reins over to you guys, let you guys pick the topic for the show. And when we do that, those polls are found on Twitter. Instagram, you can find us there as well. There's nothing overly special about the Instagram, but check it out anyway. Convince Me Show. Of course, every week, full episodes drop on YouTube with the video format. tinyurl.com/ConvinceMeShow. And of course, the podcast drops any and everywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. If we're not where you listen to your favorite podcasts, let us know and we'll do what we can to get there. Weekly shill wrapped up. I'm ready to jump into this. I've had a lot of fun researching this. I've had my 6-year-old listening to some good music while I've researched this. Tonight, we're going back to the Sunset Strip in the 1980s. Heavy metal, glam rock, hair metal, rock and roll from the 80s is one of, if not my favorite genres of music. And with it being Rock-tober, tonight we're going to take you back and we are going to find out there were a lot of great bands in that era that lump into this, that come from that LA club scene, that really were part of the initial wave of arena rock. Tonight we're looking at those 80s rock bands. Bennett repping one of the great ones. I don't care what anybody says. Just because Bret Michaels did some cheesy teenage chick shows later in the 2000s doesn't mean Poison in the 80s wasn't fantastic. But Poison is not one of the ones up for debate tonight. Tonight, it is myself representing the world's most notorious rock band, Mötley Crüe, and Mr. Bennett representing Guns N' Roses. Elrod, judging by the intro, I assume you don't know what's going on before we mediate this.
I have absolutely no idea what's going on tonight. I mean, what better person to judge glam rock than this guy right here? Am I right?
That's a fair point, probably.
You're going to learn tonight.
All right, Elrod.
All right. So to determine who goes first tonight has a Guns N' Roses theme.
Cheers.
And it specifically has to do with Appetite for Destruction, the first album that we'll hear more about tonight from Bennett. And you're going to need a sheet of paper and a pencil or pen for this. It's a very simple question. I want to know, without going over, and if both of you go over, whoever's closest, what is the running time for Appetite for Destruction? The entire album.
I feel like this is an unfair question.
Well, I make the rules here, so I don't care. Don't care. Right. We good?
No, hang on. I'm doing math. I never know we're doing math every single time. This is not right. Okay. This is a.
Rhett looks pretty confident. He wrote down that answer pretty quick.
Are we ready?
That means I had no idea and just wrote a number.
I should know. Shame on me.
All right, show me what you got.
Oh.
Rudd has 42 minutes and 13 seconds, and Bennett has 55 minutes and 42 seconds. The running time for Appetite for Destruction is 53 minutes and 52 seconds. So
plus the 1 minute secret song that you missed too. Dang.
We're going by
to
the ultimate authority on anything, and that is Wikipedia. Wikipedia has it at 53 minutes.
No, I had a college teacher when Wikipedia was just a very, very new thing, and she would always give us some sort of assignment, and she'd be like, I don't want y'all going on that Webpedia and looking up what to write down on the Webpedia. So no,
I broke that rule tonight. So, right, do you want to go first or second in your opening statement tonight?
I will let Guns N' Roses be the opening act to this show.
Oh.
it won't be the first time. Get into.
All right, Bennett. Tell me why Guns N' Roses is the better 80s band than Mötley Crüe.
All right. We're not actually going to go back in time this time, but I am going to do, when I don't go back in time, I like to use an analogy. So here's our analogy for this week's show. You've got Robert Downey Jr., okay? Follow me here.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Carrey and Leonardo DiCaprio.
Mm-hmm.
All three of these guys have very, very interesting backstories, really great Hollywood stories behind these guys. You know, stuff that they went through to get to where they were. Now, keep following me here. Now let's look at the Los Angeles Lakers. 17 championships, including dominating in the early 50s, late 80s, them three-peating in the early 2000s, and recently is winning this year's championship with LeBron. That's another great success story about the city of LA. But in many ways here, the rise and the fame that Guns N' Roses had in becoming one of the world's biggest bands in the 80s really represents like the ultimate Hollywood success story. It's basically a tale of five bros who left their past lives behind, and they would form this band, and this band would pretty much change the course of rock music in the 80s. They were unique. They displayed this really unique blend of diversity. They were raw, they were vulgar, they were violent, and then they could also be vulnerable, and they could also be sensitive at times too. It's very, very, very diverse. And when you look at it, you're looking at a time when music was dominated by the dance scene and the poppy scene and the glam metal scene. And these five guys here, they brought hard rock back to the forefront. And I strongly believe that they're responsible for really altering the course of rock music during the 80s. I think that Guns N' Roses made other rock bands be better, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But talking about tonight, Elrod, I'm going to do my best to persuade you about these five guys that make up Guns N' Roses and try to convince you that Guns N' Roses is the best rock band to come out of the 80s.
All right. Going to the jungle. Okay, Sir Rutt, tell me why Mötley Crüe. And why does Mötley Crüe have the two little dots above their name? Maybe you can tell me that and tell me why they're better than Guns N' Roses.
Well, they have their two little dots above their name because they're metal emulants. They're metal. They're cool. We'll get to the name Mötley Crüe later, but to kind of set the stage for that, when I tell you there are four guys, one of them is in his early 20s, growing up from a life where he never knew his father. His mother kind of got around, didn't really care about him. Along with another guy who grew up very privileged, very middle class, from a good home with loving parents. Another guy that was about 10 years older than that was diagnosed early in his life with a spinal disease that basically caused severe arthritis on his back and caused him to where he would stiffen up and wouldn't move. And another guy was a normal everyday kid whose claim to fame came from doing cover bands at birthday parties. If I told you though about those four gentlemen, what would you think they would have in common?
Not part of a rock band.
Not part of a rock band, not a lot in common. But when these four men, when the fates brought them together, they went on to define and redefine exactly what we think of when we think of that LA early 80s, early to mid 80s heavy metal, hard rock, glam metal scene. And you've heard the term sex, drugs, rock and roll. No band has ever lived up to the moniker of sex, drugs, and rock and roll like what happened when those four guys came together. Those four guys came together, lived one of the most destructive lifestyles any group of people could live. Most people couldn't function under the conditions they were under, yet that group went on to sell over 100 million albums across the world. That group went on to 7 platinum and multi-platinum albums. That group of four men went on to put out 22 top 40 mainstream rock hits and even 6 top 20 pop singles. That collection of four men has 3 Grammy nominations. That collection of four men have 4 New York Times bestsellers. That group of four men has a star on the Hollywood Rock of Fame. Those four men are the world's most notorious rock band. And tonight I'm going to tell you how that motley looking crew of misfits with nothing in common became Mötley Crüe. And if you want to know how that story plays out, you're going to have to check out the full episode. If you're watching us on Facebook, this is where we're going to cut the Facebook feed. Check out the episode tomorrow on YouTube or where you get your favorite podcasts. We hope you'll check us out. If you're currently on YouTube or listening to the podcast, we will be right back right after this. And we are back. Elrod, you've heard opening arguments. Where are we heading now?
We are going to head to the beginning, and I want to know, we'll start off with you, Rod. I want to know about Mötley Crüe's members or band members, and I want to know how you kind of alluded to this band having nothing in common, but take me back to how they started out as a band.
Well, as I said in my opening statements, one of the members had a rough childhood. Never knew his father. His mother never really cared about him. And he moved out to the point that he was so fed up, he tried to reach out to his father. His father wanted nothing to do with him, and he legally went and changed his name. And he changed his name to Nicky Six. Well, Nicky Six had been playing the guitar and specifically the bass guitar since he was a kid. That was his escape from his life. Uh, and he had been in a few bands in the LA club scene. He was in a band called London. And he didn't particularly get along with the rest of his bandmates and ended up getting a fight with one of them on stage. And he played a show one night. I'm not 100% sure. It may have been the Whisky a Go Go, one of the the famous LA clubs there. And afterwards, he's approached by this kid. Well, I say kid, they were about the same age that was in the audience, that told him how big of a fan he was. Said he had his picture on his wall and he wanted to play with him sometime. This kid was a guy that played the drums. This man was a guy that is known to the world as Tommy Lee. So Tommy Lee, Nicky Six ends up leaving London. Him and Tommy Lee start jamming together. Them and a guy named Greg Leon, who did some vocals, played some lead guitar. Well, this Greg Leon guy decided he didn't really want to play with them anymore, and decided he would stop. So he stopped playing with them, and they noticed an ad in an LA newspaper that read "Loud, Rude, and Aggressive Guitar Player Available." They saw that in the LA paper called The Recycler, and they had decided they were going to look for some new members, and they saw this ad and they called this guy whose name was Bob Deal. And they bring in Bob Deal, and he told them that he wanted to be called Mick Mars. Now, Mick Mars was the older gentleman. Mick Mars was kind of a grumpy older gentleman. I say older. He was probably in his late 20s, where they were in their younger 20s. But he was a fantastic guitar player. So at that point, they needed a singer. They auditioned a few guys. None of them really worked out until they were at the Starwood, another famous LA club, one night. And they see a band called Rock Candy. Rock Candy was kind of a cover band for some not very metal music, a lot of it. And the singer was pretty good, and Tommy Lee recognized the singer. He said, "I went to high school with that guy. I played in a couple bands in high school with that guy." He knew him. And after they saw him that night, Mick Mars said, "Well, then we should get him." That guy was Vince Neil. They approach Vince Neil, ask him to join this band, and he tells them no. He's happy with Rock Candy, but the other members of Rock Candy had other things going on. They weren't really serious about the music. Finally, Vince Neil called Tommy Lee back and said, "You know what? I'll do it." And not long after that, they played their first gig at the Starwood, that same club. Now, when they get together, they think they've got something, and they want to come up with this really cool name. And Nicky Six had a name that he was dead set on. He thought it was going to be fantastic, that the world was going to love that name, and it was going to become part of a household name. And that name for this band that he thought was the ultimate rock and roll name was Christmas. He wanted to call the band Christmas. And the rest of them made fun of him and shot it down. But Mick Mars actually had an idea in mind that in a previous band he had been in, somebody said that the band he was in was an awful motley looking crew. And he thought, you know what? This is the name of the band, Mötley Crüe. And they took it. Nicky Six looked at it, changed some stuff around, changed the spelling of Crüe, put the metallic emulates over the O in Motley and the U in Crüe to make it cool. and that was the name on the headliner the night they played the Starwood, and that was the name that would go on. So they realized they started to become a big deal on the LA club scene. They self-produced their first record on their own record label called Leather Records. Leather, Leathur, with the amulets over the U. And nobody's on their own label. They released their first record, Too Fast for Love, and sold 20,000 copies off their own label. Well, they were becoming such a big deal in the LA scene. They finally they got a manager, and they end up getting several record deals offered to them, and they end up signing with Electrica Records, who takes Too Fast for Love, remixes it, and then releases it. And in order to kind of get themselves going, they went on a Canadian tour. The first time they played outside of LA, they went on a Canadian tour called Cruising Through Canada Tour 82. And this is where Mötley Crüe started to gain their reputation. There were several incidents that happened on the Cruising Through Canada Tour 82. First, the band was arrested and then released at the Edmonton International Airport for wearing their spiked stage wardrobe through the airport, which was considered dangerous weapons as they wore them through customs. And Vince Neil was arrested because he had a small carry-on filled with pornographic magazines, which was considered indecent material. Both of these incidents were staged PR stunts by the band to try to get a little press, and it worked. Now, Customs in Edmonton confiscated all of these items, both the magazines and the wardrobe. Then they were playing the Sandals Disco in Edmonton when there was a bomb threat against the band that was made. This made the front page of the Edmonton Journal. Tommy Lee and their manager at the time were questioned about it. And that too ended up being a staged PR stunt to get some press. Lastly, while they were on that tour, Tommy Lee threw a television set from the upper story window of the Sheraton Caravan Hotel. And ultimately, a rock magazine reported that Mötley Crüe had been banned for life from the city of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. This was their first stop on their first tour. The tour ended early because it was a financial disaster, as you can imagine, with all of things being broken and things being having to pay for, and nobody really knew who they were yet. But this was the germ that sparked it. This is what gave them their first international press. This is what got people talking about Mötley Crüe.
I like it. I like it. It's bad when the Canadians hate your butt and ban you from their city. It's pretty bad. You got to make them really mad.
They later told them they were sorry and lifted the ban. They did play Edmonton again.
There we go. That's nice of them.
Yeah.
That's nice of them. All right, Bennett, take me to the other end of the Sunset Strip and tell me about how Guns N' Roses became a band, and tell me about their members.
All right. So the story of Guns N' Roses, at least their beginnings, goes a little like this. You got 5 kids, all with very different backgrounds from different parts of the United States. And these 5 guys would come together in LA, of all places, to form one of the world's biggest bands. The 5 original members of Guns N' Roses were Axl Rose on lead vocals, Slash on the guitar, Duff McKagan on the bass, Izzy Stradlin on guitar, and Steven Adler on drums. Now, these guys would, like I said, they eventually all found each other in California. And the first 2 to make it to LA would be Steven Adler, who was born Michael Coletti and Saul Hudson. You may not know who Saul Hudson is, but he would later be known as Slash. And these two guys arrived sometime around the early 70s. Now, Adler, he came with his big brother and his single mom who was looking to start a new life in a new area. She was leaving a abusive husband behind in Cleveland, Ohio. And Slash, he made it to LA. He was actually born in London and landed a show in a show business environment in LA with some pretty famous house guests that included the David Bowie. Yes, that David Bowie, because at one point David Bowie was dating his mother, and also was roommates with Rolling Stones Ron Wood. Um, by this time, Slash he's still a pretty young guy, but he began drinking regularly, and for the most part was pretty much left unsupervised. And since you've got this kid who's out drinking and left by themselves, what's he going to do? He's going to go out and explore the Hollywood nightlife. So you got this young kid by himself, drunk, stroll around LA. That doesn't sound like the Slash that I know. That okay. Now, as
I sense some sarcasm.
oh yeah, a little bit. Anywho, fate would have it, Slash and Adler, they would wind up attending the same school in Bancroft Junior High. Of course, they struck up a friendship pretty fast, and this prompted Adler to invite Slash over to his. Slash had nothing else to do, so yeah, he's like, sure, I'll come over to your house and hang out. And this is when Adler was like, yeah, check out my electric guitar, my amp, all this stuff. He thought it was cool, blah blah blah. So these two guys, they formed a band during their time at Fairfax High in high school, and mostly though they didn't really go to school to study. It was more or less just a meeting point for them to hang out, talk music, and get stoned. Pretty much is what they did in high school. Adler dropped out in the 10th grade, and Slash, not to be one up, he dropped out in the 11th grade. But by this time, they said that he was so proficient on the guitar, and his skills were good enough. They actually landed him a spot on a band called Titus Sloan. Meanwhile, while you've got these two in LA, you've got a pair of students from Jefferson High School in Lafayette, Indiana. Jeffrey Isbell, better known as Izzy Stradlin, and Bill Bailey. Now, the name Bill Bailey might not ring a bell either, but we'll get to that. These two guys also found a common ground with similar music taste. Bailey actually sang and played piano in his church. Keep that in mind. He and Stradlin soon bonded over their shared interests, and they enjoyed listening to pretty much like the typical bands that guys listened to at the time, like Led Zeppelin, stuff like that. Now, Bailey at this time discovered that his real dad wasn't who he thought he was. His real dad was a man named William Rose. So Bailey started referring to himself as W. Axl Rose after his involvement in a band called Axl. Soon he dropped out of school and drew attention of the authorities with frequent public intoxication charges and overall just fighting and causing a ruckus. Stradlin finished high school in 1980. So we've got one that finished.
There we go.
Major props to him. I thought for sure we'd go over, but we didn't. So, but after he finished his high school, he fled Lafayette to pursue his musical ambitions in LA, of course. He enjoyed more immediate success than a lot of these other guys. He landed a gig as a drummer in a cross-dressing band called Naughty Women before moving on to gigs with the Adams and a band called Shire. Now, Rose, he tracked down Stradlin because he would frequently visit LA. And eventually these two would join up in 1982. And after a stint with a group band called Rapid Fire. So Rose and Stradlin, they team up with this local guitarist, and they form this band. They go through some various band names. Anywho, fast fast forward just a little bit, and since they're already familiar with the others, you've got Slash and Adler, who briefly joined this Hollywood Rose lineup in '84 before this band splits. There's a whole lot of coming to band, breaking up, coming to band, splitting up, blah 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 blah. And so after they split up, Stradlin joined this heavy metal group, and Rose landed as a guitarist in Tracy Gunn's group, the LA Guns. So we've got four of them, and they kind of get together. They're off and on, blah blah blah. Now the final piece of this Guns N' Roses puzzle arrives from Seattle by a guy named Michael Duff McKagan in the fall of '84. He's the youngest child of a large musical family. He grew up listening to the Beatles and Rolling Stones as influences, and he kind of started getting into like the punk movement with Iggy Pop, stuff like that. So in early '85, McKagan received an invite from Stradlin, who's actually one of his neighbors, to join the band formed by remnants of the LA Guns and Hollywood Rose. So what they do is they take part of one name, take part of the other name, and they come up with Guns N' Roses. And this features Axl Rose on the vocals, Tracy Guns on lead guitar, Stradlin on rhythm guitar, and Rob Gardner on the drums. And in McKagan's words, this is the last guy that came in. He was unsure whether Tracy Guns and this Rob Gardner guy were actually really ready to put everything they had on the line for the group and really commit to it. So what he does is he lines up this tour of gigs all along the West Coast and to test everybody's commitment, more of like a test, if you will, for them. So Guns and Gardner, they kind of back out. They weren't really all that committed to the group. So when they back out, the members of the road crew, which is Slash and Adler, they were quick to step in as replacements. And that's how they form the group as we know it as Guns N' Roses. So flash forward real quick to June of '85. You got Rose, Slash, Stradlin, McKagan, and Adler. They enter the studio to rehearse together for the first time. And McKagan said, from the moment the five of us leaned into our first song, we could all hear and feel that the fit was right. He said the chemistry was immediate, it was thunderous, and it was soulful. It was amazing, and all of us recognized it instantly. So soon afterwards, they think, yeah, we got something going here. They set out to perform a slew of concerts dubbed the Hell Tour. It's a journey that forced them to pretty much hitchhike a 1,100-mile trip up to Seattle after their car broke down right outside of LA. But amazingly, the ordeal actually brought them close together, and they made it up to Seattle hitchhiking pretty much with just them and their gear. They had to leave a lot of stuff behind. But after this tour, do what?
Did they get arrested?
I'm sure probably once or twice. I don't know.
Well,
but
Mötley Crüe's got that on them so far.
So they make it to Seattle. They do their thing. They make it back to LA, and when they make it back to LA, this would be kind of the beginning of what we know as Guns N' Roses.
All right, I'm going to switch this up a little bit and go to Rut and ask him to tell me about the breakout for Mötley Crüe. Tell me about that.
So, Crüe came back from Cruising Through Canada tour '82, went back to the LA club scene for a bit. They got a little bit of a name for themselves. They started a tour as the opening act for Kiss, played a few shows, and Gene Simmons promptly removed them from the tour for their bad behavior. Um,
Mm.
but they got a gig at the U.S. Festival. It was held Labor Day weekend of '82 and Memorial Day weekend of '83. It was held twice, and it was a big festival in LA, not like the festivals we know now, but kind of one of the precursors. Um, they played that in May of 1983, and when they were there, they got noticed by another person on that tour, somebody that we all may have heard of, a man by the name of Ozzy Osbourne. Played the U.S. Festival in '83, noticed Mötley Crüe, liked Mötley Crüe, invited Mötley Crüe to be the opening act for his 1984 Bark at the Moon tour. Nikki Sixx said of this tour with Ozzy, "We thought we had elevated animal behavior into an art form, but then we met Ozzy." He calls Ozzy Osbourne the match that set the whole band ablaze. And as a kind of a look at what this tour looked like, not on stage, but when they weren't on stage, there's a particular story in Mötley Crüe's book. The scene made it to Mötley Crüe's movie they put out on Netflix that I will talk about later on. It is a story that Mötley Crüe, or that Ozzy Osbourne's band, this was Ozzy Osbourne's solo band. He had broken up from Black Sabbath by this point in the early '80s. He'd left Sabbath. Um, a member of his band claims this never happened. All four members of Mötley Crüe swear up and down it did. Ozzy, unsurprisingly, says he doesn't remember if it happened or not. He doesn't deny it, but he says he doesn't remember. But supposedly, on an off day between dates in Lakeland, Florida, they were at the pool of the hotel they were staying in, and the Mötley Crüe guys were hanging out by the pool, talking, staring at chicks, halfway out of their minds, when Ozzy comes down to the pool wearing a dress because he's Ozzy Osbourne. And he gives the guys a just some notes, being Uncle Ozzy, as they called him, telling them about life on the road. And then he tells them to give him a straw and a bump of Coke. And they told him, they said, "Ozzy, man, we ran out of blow. We don't have any more." He said, "I asked you for a straw." Tommy Lee takes a straw out of the drink he's drinking, gives it to Ozzy, and Ozzy promptly gets down on all fours, takes the straw, puts it in his nose, and snorts a line of ants that were crawling on the ground, much to the amusement of the guys in Mötley Crüe. Then Ozzy stood up, lifted up his dress he was wearing with nothing underneath, and proceeded to urinate right there on the ground beside the pool in front of all the people staying at the pool that day, and then got down on all fours again and began drinking his own urine.
Wow.
And as messed up as Mötley Crüe was, they thought this was hilarious, fantastic, as you can understand why you would think it was funny. Ozzy dares Nikki Sixx to do the same. Well, Nikki has no problem following suit and urinating on the ground, but he hesitates before he gets down on all fours, and then Ozzy gets on all fours and laps up Nikki Sixx's urine as well. Again, a band member of Ozzy says this never happened. All four Mötley Crüe guys swear it did. Ozzy does not remember if it happened or not. But this kind of tells you what life was like on that Bark at the Moon tour in '84. Now, before they went on this tour in late '83, they released their second album, Shout at the Devil. Now, this album generated a lot of controversy for its title track, Shout at the Devil, its album imagery. There was a pentagram on the cover of this album. There was a lot of Satanism involved there. This is the mid 80s. There's the satanic panic thing going on. So this really caused a lot of controversy. But this album represented the band's mainstream breakthrough. That album and the Bark at the Moon tour with Ozzy uh, really was their breakthrough. The album went on to eventually become 4 times platinum, and the Loudwire, the music magazine, called Shout at the Devil the most influential hair metal album of all time. And I will go more into that here shortly.
All right. Well, I don't know what to think after hearing those stories, but
He's
Bennett,
Ozzy Osbourne. He does what he wants to do.
Bennett,
God!
surely to goodness he can top that. Guns N' Roses has to have a urine ant story, hopefully.
I don't really have any urine and stories, at least not in this segment. Can't really
Ooh.
top Ozzy, but we'll give it a go. So, to talk a little bit about their success, their breakthrough success came in the form of their debut album, but more specifically, it would come from actually the tour that followed it more so than the album, and that's Appetite for Destruction. This is one of the more famous and well known albums along uh, rock music lovers and people that love music in general. It was released January 21st, 1987, which was roughly about 2 years after the band was formed. They had some pretty huge hits on that, but we'll talk about that later. I don't want to get into that too much right now. You've got in the U.S. Welcome to the Jungle, which was issued as the album's first single in October. That was accompanied by a music video. Initially, this album the album single lingered for almost a year without really performing well. But the I think it's Geffen. Is that the name of the what do you call it? The record label or whatever.
Yep.
The founder of it, obviously David Geffen, he was asked to kind of lend some support for this group, and so he obliged, and he personally convinced MTV executives to play "Welcome to the Jungle" during the network's like after hours rotation. And so this video was initially really only played like 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, something like that on Sundays. And people really loved it. They took notice of the song and of the video, and before they knew it, they were requesting them MTV to play this song all the time. So that kind of gave them a little bit of a jump start on their popularity. They would go on to tour extensively to support this debut album because it came out to not a whole lot of fanfare really, which is crazy to look back on now. They went on a 16-month long tour for this Appetite of Destruction album, and they were very creative. They named the tour the Appetite for Destruction Tour. Very creative name. I don't know where that came from. So, in addition to headlining in Europe and US, they opened North American shows for some pretty big known people like the Cult, Alice Cooper, and some band called Mötley Crüe. They opened up for them too, and they did this throughout the second half, the later part of '87. So during this '87 tour, though, they kind of got into a little bit of some trouble here. We're going to talk about. So the drummer, Steven Adler, he broke his hand in a fight, and he had to be replaced for 8 shows. Then the bassist, Duff McKagan, he was like the one that we said was the 5th part of their group. He missed several shows in May of '88, but he had a good reason. He was attending his wedding, so that's why he couldn't make some of these shows. And so
He's not committed enough. Not committed enough to the band.
apparently not. So interestingly, though, Don Henley of the Eagles played drums for the band during the 1989 AMA show while Adler was in rehab. And so the band proceeded with the tour, going in the U.S., Australia, and Japan. And they were serving for the acts at this time for pretty big name groups as well. Talking about groups like Iron Maiden and Aerosmith. So they're rising up pretty quick here, and to kind of show how their popularity just kind of exploded out of nowhere, going from a little fanfare when the album came out to this tour where they wound up. Like those Facebook things where it's like where I started out and where I'm at now. This is kind of like what Guns N' Roses did, where they started out at and where they wound up. So Tim Collins, this was Aerosmith's manager at the time. He said by the end of the tour, Guns N' Roses, they were huge. They basically just exploded. We were all pissed that Rolling Stone magazine showed up to do a story on Aerosmith, but Guns N' Roses ended up on the cover of the magazine. And he said suddenly the opening act was bigger than we were. And so this tour would land several Guns N' Roses songs on the Billboard Hot List, and it helped them to sell millions of albums, and it would go on to become a record-setting start of their career. We'll talk about that a little bit too.
That is an excellent segue, my friend. I want to stick with you on this. You tell me a
Before,
little bit about.
before we do, I
Oh,
just want to add something here. Aerosmith needs to do better at picking their opening acts from their own point of view. Bennett says here that Guns N' Roses opened for them and completely outshone them before the tour was over. Speaking from personal experience, I have seen Aerosmith in concert twice. The first time I saw them, the opening band before Aerosmith hit the stage was Kiss. And Kiss absolutely blew the doors off the place. And by the time Aerosmith came out, it was meh.
meh.
Second time I saw Aerosmith, Mr. Bennett was with me. The last
Mhm.
show ever at the famed Nashville Starwood Amphitheater, they had an opening band called Mötley Crüe.
Hey, that
Again,
was a cold concert.
it
We
was
froze.
cold. It was cold.
It was
It was
cold.
wet.
Wet.
You didn't even notice it when Crüe was on stage. Crüe
Mm-mm.
blew the roof off the place. And then when Aerosmith was on stage, you realized it's really cold and wet, and I'm not 100% sure I want to be here. Aerosmith needs
Is Aerosmith the most overrated rock band of all time?
They might sound good if they picked crappy opening acts.
I mean, Rut nailed it. That was an incredible concert that Molly put on. And then Aerosmith came out, and we are kind of like, do we stay? Do we go? We're already here. We paid for the ticket. But I was ready to go after Molly. I was like, okay, man,
Can't top us. Let's go.
my eardrums are busted. I'm ready to run through a brick wall. So
Let's go snort some ants, guys. That's how you felt after the Mötley Crüe.
didn't
Let's
feel
go
like
snort some
that. I did feel really cold.
But tell me about the best and biggest albums for Guns N' Roses.
This may come to a surprise to you, but I'm gonna kind of cheat here. Their best and their biggest album would be Appetite for Destruction. We talked about it a little bit before. I'm gonna do Appetite for Destruction, kind of like how Elrod did for was that for Rocky?
Rocky.
This is going to be my Appetite for
And
Destruction.
you had a drinking game that night, and the subject was every time I said Rocky, you had to take a shot. That person's going to be in the ICU somewhere. I'm pretty
That
sure.
person would qualify to be a member of Mötley Crüe.
On the B team. So like I said, we talked a little bit about their tour that they went on for this debut album that they have. And wouldn't you know that Appetite for Destruction would go on to be one of the biggest albums by any artist of all time. Like I said, it was released July 21st, 1987. It was their debut album. And personally, if you ask me, one could not have asked for a more successful album to jumpstart your career, really. Axl Rose stated that many of the songs on the album were actually written while the band was performing in the LA club circuit. And a number of those songs would be featured kind of later on in some of their albums, and but some of them actually were considered for Appetite for Destruction. I'm not gonna go through the whole list of the songs that they decided to cut off of Appetite for Destruction, but there is one very, very noteworthy song that did not make the cut for Appetite for Destruction. That was November Rain. They considered put. Can you imagine if they would have put that on this album too? That would have been a killer. It already was a killer album, but they said their reasoning for not putting November Rain on there is they already had their one obliged ballad that everybody was doing back then in the 80s, and that was Sweet Child of Mine. So so we got a no November Rain. Elrod, do you know that song, November
I
Rain?
do. I was listening to
Okay.
it today, actually. Great song.
I'm proud. So
Very familiar with it.
so now they needed to get a producer, and so they had a producer by the name of Spencer Profer. He was hired to record Night Train and Sweet Child of Mine, kind of like a test run to kind of see how the chemistry was, kind of how they bonded together. They went on to record 9 songs, so I mean, I guess there was some chemistry there. Interestingly enough, the band initially had considered Paul Stanley from Kiss to produce this album, but they regretfully rejected him because he wanted to change Adler's drum set more than Adler wanted to. I feel like you probably should have listened to Paul Stanley because he probably knows what he's talking about, but teach their own. So this guy, Mike Klink, he was chosen to be their producer, and the group recorded Shadow of Your Love first with him, kind of like as a test. And all was well, everything was clicking. So, with all the pieces in the place, the band entered Daryl Dragon's Rumbo Records in January of 1987. They spent 2 weeks kind of recording basic tracks with Klink, doing his thing, splicing everything together, taking all the best takes. They said that this producer worked 18-hour days for a solid month to get this album down. And you had Slash, it was overdubbing in the afternoon, the evenings, and Rose was performing his vocals all the time. Slash really struggled to kind of find his guitar sound before coming up with the Gibson Les Paul guitar plugged into a Marshall amplifier. That's the sound that he liked, and that's pretty much what he's went with ever since then. And we'll talk a little bit about that later too. But Slash, he spent hours and hours and hours with this producer, Mike Klink, paring down a structure and solos. The budget for the album was around 370,000, which is quite a bit of money, I would say, in '87. According to drummer Steven Adler, of course, he said the percussion was done in just 6 days, and he was done with his. But he said Axl Rose's vocals was kind of what took so long. It took much, much longer than they anticipated, but Axl insisted on doing them one line at a time as like a perfectionist. Yeah, he was doing them one line at a time. So, but finally, the overdubs and the mix and everything was done. They did it at Media Sound Studios, and all the mastering was done at Sterling Sound in New York City. Like I said before, the album really got little mainstream attention initially. The week of August 6, 1987, Appetite for Destruction debuted at number 182 on the Billboard 200, and it wouldn't really top the charts until August 6th of 1988, which was 1 year later to the day after they had started going on tour, and you started to see the music videos on TV, and they started getting a little bit of airplay. They had a few singles that were getting played that was really helping this album move. You had "Welcome to the Jungle," "Paradise City," and "Sweet Child of Mine." That was kind of their bread and butter. That was really gaining the interest of the listeners here, and people kind of getting excited for the band. And pretty much when these three songs dropped, that's when the album exploded. It spent four non-consecutive weeks at number one, and it spent a total of 147 weeks on the Billboard 200. September 2008, by September 2008, this album has been certified platinum 18 times by the Recording Industry Association of America, and it shipped over 18 million copies in the United States, which made it the country's 11th best-selling album ever. And according to Billboard in 2008, same year, it was also the best-selling debut album of all time in the United States. It sold upwards of 30 million albums worldwide, which puts it up there, not at the very, very top, but it puts it among the ranks as one of the best-selling albums of all time. A little bit about this album. 1989, Rolling Stone ranked Appetite for Destruction as the 27th best album of the 1980s, and 62 on their list of 500 greatest albums of all time. 2003, VH1 named Appetite for Destruction the 42nd greatest album of all time, and ranked 18 on Spin's magazine's 100 greatest albums from 85 to 05. And later, a little bit later, 2006, album was placed number 2 on Guitar World magazine's list of the 100 greatest guitar albums of all time. And finally, the album was ranked 32nd overall in the Rock Hall of Fame's definitive 200 album list. So it had a slow start, but it definitely gained steam as it went along there.
It sold a boatload of records, as you just said. All right. So, Rut, tell me about Mötley Crüe's best and biggest albums. I assume you don't have an album bigger than Appetite for Destruction.
Bigger? No. Better? Maybe. They definitely had more albums. But no, Mötley Crüe has had 9 studio albums, and I think it's important to point out that they've never had one go less than gold. And 7 of those 9 went at least platinum, if not multi-platinum. But I'm going to touch on 3 of those 9. And the first one I want to touch on is the one I mentioned earlier that really was their breakthrough coming off that tour with Ozzy. And that was Shout at the Devil that they put out at the end of 83. I said that Loudwire called it the most influential hair metal album of all time. Here's the complete rundown of what Loudwire said about Shout at the Devil. Shout gave that movement its signature statement and an all-important catalyst, something not even Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, its only legitimate competitor for top of this podium, could lay claim to, arriving all of 4 years later. For all their hooks and retroactive mass appeal, heavy, uncompromising songs like Looks That Kill, Too Young to Fall in Love, and the title cut, Shout at the Devil, were designed to shock and awe, not make friends or even sell buttloads of records. They just sold them anyway, because Crüe captured the zeitgeist of America's rising heavy metal wave by the throats, sank their fangs in, and refused to let go for a decade and beyond. Shout at the Devil sold 200,000 copies in the first 2 weeks in 1983. That's not like today where you can go download a record the day it drops. I'm sure if Taylor Swift drops an album, 200,000 is nothing. But we're talking 1983. You got to go. You can't order it off Amazon. You've got to go to a brick and mortar store and buy it. They sold 200,000 copies in the first week. It eventually did go 4 times platinum, and that was their big breakthrough. The second album I want to talk about was their fourth studio album, and that's Girls, Girls, Girls. Girls, Girls, Girls was their third straight album to go 4 times platinum. Shout at the Devil, then Theater of Pain, then Girls, Girls, Girls. This album peaked at number 2 on the Billboard 200 charts, and there's a conspiracy theory going back a few weeks on the show as to why it didn't reach number 1. Because as it on its rise up the charts, it hit number 2, and everyone thought for sure that it would be number 1 the next week. The next week, it remained at number 2, and number 1 was Whitney Houston's album. It was the debut of her second album. Nikki Sixx has said in interviews since then that he believes Girls, Girls, Girls should have and would have reached number 1, but apparently there was quite a bit of behind-the-scenes maneuvering by Whitney Houston's record label for her album to debut at number 1. And it robbed Crüe of that number 1 spot with Girls, Girls, Girls. However, they would reach that slot with their next and arguably best album, and that was the Dr. Feelgood album. The Dr. Feelgood album went 6 times platinum, and it did reach number 1 on the Billboard 200. It is their best-selling album that they had out of all their great selling albums, and it's highly regarded, oddly enough, by both critics and fans who typically don't agree when it comes to music, but critics and fans both highly regard Dr. Feelgood as Crüe's definitive best studio album. Oddly enough, this was the first album after they all decided there was a collective quest for sobriety. And after they got sober, they recorded Dr. Feelgood and it ended up being their best album. Another thing kind of notable about the recording of this album, it was the first album. They were getting to a point here, they'd been together 8 years. They were all starting to hate each other. And in 1989, they recorded Dr. Feelgood. All 4 of them recorded their parts to the album separately. They did not record them together. They were never in the studio at the same time. But musically, this album came together. Another couple interesting notes about this album. One song on that album, they had a guest backup vocalist on one of the songs. A throwback to a few minutes ago, Steven Tyler of Aerosmith provided backing vocals on the Dr. Feelgood album. He happened to be in the studio recording a solo album of his own, and one of the producers was like, "Hey, you want to jump in and sing some backing vocals on this album?" Sure, Steven Tyler said, and jumped in. And something else notable, Bob Rock was the one who produced this album. It is because of the Dr. Feelgood album that 2 years later, or probably a year later, a gentleman by the name of Lars Ulrich reached out to Bob Rock and wanted him to produce his band's first album. That band was called Metallica. They got Bob Rock to produce their first album because of what he did on Dr. Feelgood, and he went on to produce several of Metallica's subsequent albums that really put them on the map. So the 7 of the 9 went at least platinum, but Dr. Feelgood sold the most, highly regarded as their best.
All right, Rod. Well, you just alluded to the albums. Tell me what Mötley Crüe's best and biggest singles are from those albums.
22 top 40 rock hits from Mötley Crüe. 6 top 20 pop singles from Mötley Crüe. Obviously, I'm not going to go through them all or even list them all, but just hitting the high points here. And I want to start at really their first single, and that was Looks That Kill. came off the Shout at the Devil album. They didn't really release a single from their first album. Um, so their first single came off their second album. It came off Shout at the Devil, Looks That Kill. It was written by Nikki Sixx, as a vast majority of Crüe songs were. This song spent 10 weeks on the Billboard Hot 100. The main guitar riff in the song Looks That Kill was actually listed on Guitar World's list of best riffs and guitar solos. It picked up a younger audience several years later. It appeared on Guitar Hero, and the band actually had an extensive relationship with the game Rock Band, which I might hit later on. I'm not sure if I'll get to it or not. But and another interesting part about Looks That Kill, the pre-chorus guitar riff is strikingly similar to the dungeon theme in the video game Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link. And the song was released 4 years prior to the game release. So apparently the creators of Zelda are Mötley Crüe fans, which is pretty cool. Second single I want to look at is Smoking in the Boys' Room off the Theater Pain album. And the reason I want to point this one out is because this is a cover song. Mötley Crüe kind of had a thing for doing cover songs at different parts and at different times, and still a lot of times they'll play cover songs in their live act. Smoking in the Boys' Room was a cover. It was originally recorded by Brownville Station in 73, but Crüe's version of it reached number 16 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it became their first top 40 hit. Their first top 40 hit was a cover song. Of course, they would go on to cover other songs. They covered Anarchy in the UK, the Sex Pistols song. They covered Helter Skelter, Beatles song. They were known kind of for doing covers here and there, and that one actually became their first top 40 hit. Moving to Dr. Feelgood album and the title track, Dr. Feelgood. Again, written by Nikki Sixx and Mick Mars. It was their first American top 10 hit. Hit number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it is their highest ranked single to this day. Bennett talked about power ballads earlier. The song Without You off that album, written by Nikki Sixx and Mick Mars, and features Mick Mars not on his usual guitar. It features Mick Mars on a steel guitar, which is something that's kind of hard to imagine, but there he was. And this was actually said, the song was actually written about Tommy Lee's relationship with famed actress and wife Heather Locklear at the time. This reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it charted on the mainstream rock chart. It charted on the UK singles chart. If you made me pick a favorite Mötley Crüe song, one of them would be Girl Don't Go Away Mad. Just Go Away. That would be one of them. The other one would be Kickstart My Heart. Written by Nikki Sixx, and the phrase Kickstart My Heart refers supposedly to Nikki Sixx's overdose, 1987, which I will touch on here in a little bit. But Nikki Sixx was legally dead of a heroin overdose until an EMT injected his heart with adrenaline. That's what brought him back to life.
Wait a minute. I thought you were going to say Ozzy Osbourne shows up with a straw and slurps it all out.
No, just a syringe of adrenaline to counteract his other syringe that killed him earlier. But that adrenaline that gave him a kickstart to the heart, and that's where it came from.
Legend.
Yeah. Ironically enough, Nikki Sixx said that the origins of the song said that he wrote it while the band was already working on the Dr. Feelgood album, and that in his original version, he played it just playing around with an acoustic guitar in his house, scribbling words down on a piece of paper. And when the group's former manager read the lyrics that he had written down, he said, Nikki, you got to take this to the band. And he was kind of reluctant to do it, but eventually he did. And the track came together, and it's one of their more iconic songs, with the opening riff of that song. Mick Mars' opening riff on that song. If you've ever seen Mötley Crüe live, and granted, a lot of times they close with a show, but one particular show I saw them, Bennett, I'm pretty sure you were there too. Were you there when Hinder and Theory of a Dead Man opened?
I don't think so.
You may not
I
have
don't
been
think.
with me at that show, but we've all been to concerts. You know, the curtains up, the lights go out. You know the show's about to start. That particular show, they started the show with "Kickstart My Heart," and just a dark arena that's a buzz because they know something's about to happen. The curtains up, and you just hear that opening, that dur, dur, incredible moment.
Everyone
Last,
knows it.
I know. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Elrod, you need to go
Totally.
educate yourself after this. But probably their most iconic song, which ironically enough is nowhere near their best song as far as how it charted, how it did, but probably their most well-known song, Home Sweet Home. The original release of Home Sweet Home only charted at number 89 on the Billboard Hot 100. Now they re-released it. They put together in 1990 called A Decade of Decadence, which was kind of a re-release of a lot of their stuff, and they had a Home Sweet Home 91. That one made it to the charts at number 37. So it never charted really high, but it's probably their best known song. As a matter of fact, VH1's chart of greatest power ballads of all time has Home Sweet Home coming in at number 12.
Hmm.
It's also their most covered song being covered by other people. It was written by Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee. Tommy Lee gets a lot of the credit because of the piano part, especially at the beginning of the song. But just some of those that have covered it. It was re-recorded with Linkin Park vocalist Chester Bennington, the late Chester Bennington, on co-lead. He played it with Mötley Crüe in kind of the wake of Hurricane Katrina as kind of a charity thing. Limp Bizkit did a cover of Home Sweet Home. If you've ever seen the movie Hot Tub Time Machine, Rob Corddry did a cover of Home Sweet Home with Motley Crue. That's a fantastic movie, by the way. Two kind of notable ones, two kind of country ones. Several years ago, a group called the Nashville Outlaws got together and basically put a bunch of country people doing cover songs of Mötley Crüe songs. And Justin Moore did Home Sweet Home. Another fun fact for you, viewer, listener, there was a music video for this song, and yours truly is in it. I'm in the music video to that song. It was.
When
I went.
Me.
No, me. I went. Me and good friend of the show, Bob, went. And at first, we're in the crowd at 3rd and Lindsley in Nashville. And, we got to talk to Justin Moore and his band. They're cool guys. But I tell you, later on in the recording of the video, Mötley Crüe came into the room. And you want to talk about time standing still in an unreal experience. Everybody there is kind of laid back, cool. Hey, we're going to be in a Justin Moore video. This is cool. But Justin Moore seemed like just another one of us when Mötley Crüe came into the room. It was like gods walking into the room.
we're not worthy.
Yeah, it was definitely a Wayne's World moment there. The last cover version of this song I want to talk about is Carrie Underwood. And on the 0.0000712% chance Carrie Underwood ever listens to this show, this episode, Miss Underwood, I would like to speak to you for just a second. You are a fantastic singer. You were probably the most talented, definitely one of, if not the most talented lady singer in country music right now. It could be argued you're one of the most talented singers in the world right now. You've got a lot of success with a lot of your songs. You've made a lot of money. You're really the cream of the crop when it comes to those American Idol group. Please stop covering songs. Her version of Home Sweet Home is awful, and I refuse to listen to it. Her version of Randy Travis's I Told You So is horrible, and I refuse to listen to it. Carrie Underwood, you're not listening to this, but if by some chance you are, what you're doing with your songs is fantastic. You're killing it out there. Stop covering other people's songs, please. And thank you.
And son, if you are listening, please support us on Anchor. I think you're great.
Come back at me, bash me all over your social media accounts, and make sure you're tagging all of our socials when you bash me.
I like it. Like it. Bennett, tell me about the best and biggest singles from Guns N' Roses.
Now, it's kind of like what I covered a few episodes back about Nirvana, where a lot of the songs that I enjoy that Nirvana sing wasn't exactly their top songs. I'm not exactly going to do that again, but there are a bunch of songs, especially on the Appetite for Destruction. There's another one, Appetite for Destruction. I need to have a little ticker that ticks every time I say that. But there's a bunch of songs off that album that I'm not going to get to talk about just for time, which is a shame. But some really great songs that are not included I'm going to talk about is songs like Night Train, Mr. Brownstone, which Mr. Brownstone kind of has some controversy behind it that you can look into that I'm not going to cover. It's So Easy, which was actually their first song release in the UK before they released anything in the US. And My Michelle and Rocket Queen. Those are some other good ones to check out. But I narrowed it down to 5. It's probably the 5 that everybody knows. But hopefully I can shed some light on some of the stuff that maybe we don't know about some of these songs. And we're gonna educate Elrod a little bit about some of these songs he may have heard of, but you may not have heard some of the background to some of these songs. And the first one I want to get into is a very important one. It's Patience. This was off their second album, GNR Lies, in 1988. So they come off of their debut album. They kind of started out slow, and then they just exploded. You know, they were kind of raunchy, in your face, and they were rocking out. You know, while everybody else was doing their eyeliner and their teased hair, these guys were rocking it. And so people were expecting this second album to come out and them just elevate that bar and have louder drums, louder guitar riffs and solos. But what they got was not that. What they got was not what they expected. They got Patience. And Patience is a song where they took the bass guitar, wiped it out. They took the drums, knocked it out entirely. So it's just a song of Axl singing and whistling, singing and whistling softly, just over 3 acoustic guitars from Slash, Izzy, and Duff. And it's a beautiful song, but at the same time too, it's a very eerie and almost a haunting song to hear, especially coming from them. Says that the motivation behind this track, it's generally accepted to be it come from in the troublesome relationship that Axl Rose had with his now his ex-wife Erin Everly. And though it's never really stated in any of the album or interviews, I think there probably is some truth to that, just from the vulnerability and the honesty that you hear from him as he's singing it. According to the bass guitarist Duff McKagan, actually came up with the great lyrics seemingly out of nowhere, and that of course became the story and the melody of the song. And the song would peak at number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. Moving along, November Rain, which is off of their Use Your Illusion 1 album. This is often considered one of the greatest power ballads of all time. It's kind of like a heart on your wearing your heart on your sleeve song. And this is another song that kind of shows more of their sensitive and vulnerable side. Now you're probably listening to me, and if you're not a big huge fan of Guns N' Roses and don't know much about them, you're like, it just sounds like you've got a bunch of these sappy love songs going on, but we'll kick it up a little bit. But this song peaked at number 3 in the U.S. Billboard Hot 100, and this song itself, it's like 3 seconds under being 9 minutes long. And actually, if you do some digging, there is a demo version that came out, I think, way before even they had Appetite for Destruction. Another tick, ting, Appetite for Destruction. There's a demo that Slash and somebody else, I can't remember who, were playing, and there's an 18-minute version of this November Rain song out there. But back to the condensed version at nearly 9 minutes. This makes the longest song in history to enter in the top 10 Billboard charts, and it's the third longest song ever to enter in the Hot 100 chart. And at the time, it was the second longest to enter at its release. In July of 2018, this song, November Rain, became the first video that was made before YouTube's founding to surpass the 1 billion view mark, which is pretty incredible thinking about a song that was, 25 years before YouTube's existence to be the first to hit 1 billion views. And also it was the first music video from the 90s to hit over 1 billion YouTube streams. So I'd say it's a fairly popular song with the peoples there. Third, Sweet Child of Mine. I think everybody knows this song. I don't have to go into detail too much about it, but there's some things you may not know about the song. They say that the biggest hits often come from the simplest of writing sessions, and Sweet Child of Mine is no exception. The story goes that the band was hanging out at their house on the Sunset Strip, and Slash was just kind of goofing around with some chords and stuff. And as he's playing, the band's kind of like seeing some potential in what he's doing. They're really liking the sound, and he's just kind of like goofing off. And they're like, no, we like this. You're doing, just keep going with that. And so, and Axl Rose was listening upstairs in his room, and was listening to him with this kind of guitar riff at the beginning. And he was inspired to write the lyrics, which he completed in the following afternoon. It's based off of his then girlfriend at the time, Erin Everly, before they were married and before they split up. And he declared it as Leonard Skinner kind of serving as his inspiration for this song. He said to make sure that we got that heartfelt feeling, that's what Axl Rose said about it. And when the band recorded the demos for this, the producer, Mr. Spencer Profer, he suggested adding a breakdown at the end of the song, and all the guys were like, yeah, that sounds good. We'll do that. But they weren't really sure what to do. So as they're listening to this demo looping over and over, Rose started saying, kind of to himself at first, he's like, where do we go? Where do we go now? And Profer was like, that's it. That's what you're going to sing as the for the song, for the breakdown there. So it pretty much, the whole song pretty much happened by chance, really. It placed number 37 on Guitar World's list of the 100 greatest guitar solos. It came in at number 3 on Blender's 500 greatest songs since you were born, and number 198 on Rolling Stone's list of 500 greatest songs of all time. In '04, Total Guitar Magazine, in a Total Guitar Magazine poll, um, the introduction's famous riff that I was talking about, where Slash was just kind of goofing off, it was voted number 1 riff of all time by the readers. And it's also in Rolling Stone's 40 greatest songs that changed the world. It places number 7 of VH1's 100 greatest songs of the '80s, and it's number 210 on the RIAA Songs of the Century list. But surprisingly enough, this would be the band's only number 1 single on the Billboard Hot 100, at least for the U.S. They had some that kind of hit number 1, kind of in some other countries, but not really going to go into that just for time. But Billboard ranked this the number 5 best song of 1988. Moving along, you've got Paradise City, one of 2 songs by Guns N' Roses that you can almost guarantee you're going to hear at a live sporting event at least once in your life. That's a pretty safe bet. The song peaked at number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the band's 3rd single to reach the top 10. The story goes that this song was written in the back of a rental van when they were on their way back from playing a gig in San Francisco. And says that the band was, drinking, having a good time, kind of messing around the acoustic guitars. When they kind of came up with this intro, Duff McKagan and Easy Stradlin started playing along. Slash started humming a melody, and Axl Rose sang, "Take me down to the Paradise City." And Slash chimed in and said, "Where the grass is green and the girls are pretty." So then Rose sings the line again, and Slash shouts, okay, it's a family show, so I'm not going to say what Slash shouts out, but if you know, you know. If you don't, look it up. And
I'm assuming Elrod doesn't know.
no, you need to look that up.
I'll look that up.
I cannot say what
Family
he,
show.
but Slash thought it was hilarious. But so they then Rose finishes with "Take Me Home," and Slash preferred his second line, but the rest of the band, they kind of felt differently, and he was outvoted, so they used the first line, "Where the grass is green and the girls are pretty." I thought that was pretty fun. That was worth mentioning. Elrod, you're gonna have to look into that.
I'm gonna look that up.
During a 1988 interview, Axl told Hit Parader magazine that the verses part is more about being in the jungle, and the chorus is like being back in the Midwest or somewhere, which I thought was kind of interesting for their take on that. It doesn't really sound like there's much meaning to that, really. The song ranked number 21 on VH1's 40 greatest metal songs of all time, and ranked number 459 on Rolling Stone's 500 greatest songs of all time. So they had several of these songs make it to the 500 greatest songs of all time. And Slash has stated that Paradise City is his favorite song by the group. Last one I want to talk about, "Welcome to the Jungle." It's probably my favorite Guns N' Roses song by far. Little tidbit about this song. This song has appeared in nearly every single high school football highlight film in the South in the last 30 years. That's a little tidbit.
That one and The Warrior.
Yeah.
I am the warrior.
Mm-hmm. That's it. This song has been in every single high school football highlight film. So that's a neat little fact. Legend has it that Axl was approached by, now this is incredible if this is true. This is what the legend goes, but it's widely considered to be true. Axl kind of steps off this bus and lands in New York City, and this random homeless guy comes up to him and greets him with this line. He says, "Do you know where you are? You're in the jungle, baby. You're going to die." So this homeless man is who said this to Axel. So I wonder if the homeless man's getting royalties off this now.
I
That's
was,
my first question.
I was about
My
to say,
second,
I hope he's getting songwriting credits.
I hope so. My second question I have is when this homeless guy allegedly says this to him, did he just come up to him and nonchalantly say it? Did he yell it to him? Or did he say it to him like Axel does in the song? Does this like homeless man go, "You're gonna die"? So I have all these questions I want to know about this. But this is the first song on their debut album, which I think is the perfect opening statement from the group, and which has been heralded as the most dangerous band in the world. And we'll get to that while they're considered the most dangerous band in the world. The song peaked at number 7 on the Billboard charts, which is an absolute travesty that it was that low. Should have been number 1. In 2006, it was rated by VH1 number 26 on the list of the 100 greatest songs of the 80s. And in '09, the readers of the Rolling Stone magazine ranked it the greatest sports anthem. Go figure, right? Also in '09, Welcome to the Jungle was named the greatest hard rock song of all time by VH1.
All right, so quite the resume of singles for Guns N' Roses. Right, very briefly, tell me about some live performances for Mötley Crüe in their career.
Before Mötley Crüe ever played a show, once they came up with their name, decided they were going to be Mötley Crüe, they wanted to figure out what their image was going to be. And they were talking and they said, they wanted to stand out from what everybody was doing on the Sunset Strip. They wanted to be bigger. They wanted to be better. They wanted to be different. They decided they were going to wear crazy clothes with spikes and they were going to put on makeup, not in a Kiss level, but at a weird, facial markings thing. Um, they were even talking then on the club scene about having fire and pyro on a club level. And Tommy Lee said to them then, he said, I have this vision of me playing the drums, being upside down over the crowd while I'm playing the drums. And all of that came true. If you've ever been to a Mötley Crüe show, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The pyro is insane. If you're in the back of the arena, you can feel the fire. And there's plenty, oh, plenty, oh, plenty of fire and pyro. There's girls all over the stage dancing in next to nothing. Um, it is every bit a show. And Tommy Lee's dream of being upside down, playing his drums, has become a reality on more than one occasion. The Dr. Feelgood tour was the first one. He was in a roll cage with his stuff taped down, and he kind of went up and over the front of the crowd and was playing his drum solo upside down. I saw them once where there was a Ferris wheel on the stage, and in Tommy Lee's drum solo, his kit went in a circle inside the Ferris wheel, being upside down at the top and over during his drum solo. During their farewell tour 5 years ago now, there was a roller coaster that went from the back of the stage to the back of the arena, like a roller coaster track. And his drum set lifted up and went along this roller coaster track, flipping as it went before he ended up at the back of the arena doing his drum solo. There is a presence and a show with a Mötley Crüe show. I will say this, and what I'm about to say is going to be kind of controversial, not to a lot of people, but to myself. I saw Mötley Crüe play with Aerosmith, as I talked earlier, and by the time Aerosmith got on stage, me and Mr. Bennett talked about, we didn't know if we wanted to be there anymore because Mötley Crüe had beat us down and worn us out. It was such a fantastic show. I saw Mötley Crüe with Hinder and Theory of a Dead Man open up for them. Both good live bands. Theory of a Dead Man's a really good live band, but my goodness, they seemed like a high school talent show by the time that Mötley Crüe hit the stage. Blew me away. This last time I saw Mötley Crüe, Alice Cooper opened for Mötley Crüe. Now, Alice Cooper knows how to put on a freaking show with, he's got a freaking, he cuts a head off. He's got a big Frankenstein. He brings a boa constrictor on the stage. Alice Cooper puts on a show. There's a beheading in the middle of his show. Yet when Crüe comes out, it blows it out of the water. Here's the controversial part that I'm admitting for the first time here on this show. The other time I saw Mötley Crüe was a co-headlining tour. Mötley Crüe and Kiss. My favorite band of all time. A band I have seen in concert like 8 or 9 times. Nobody does a show like Kiss. Except for maybe Mötley Crüe. I'm not going to say Mötley Crüe was better that night. Bennett, you were at that show, aren't you? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say Crüe was better that night. They might have been very equal. But after sitting through Crüe, I was beaten down and dead tired. And I think the whole crowd was. In a sense, Mötley Crüe showed up Kiss. Kiss is the king of live shows. And they continue to be. The one night where anybody even came close to Kiss was that night. And it was Mötley Crüe. There's a presence. They show up. Here's the thing. I'm not... Bless his heart. Vince Neil had the voice of a god in 1980. That voice did not last 30, 40 years. Vince Neil does not sound that great anymore. He can't hold the notes anymore. He sounds very nasally. It doesn't sound great. It doesn't matter. Their live show now is just as good as it's ever been because of the stage antics, because of Nikki Sixx and his bass licks, because Tommy Lee is the life of a freaking show. If you've never been to a Mötley Crüe show, he gives it everything he has. He interacts with the crowd. He flies over the crowd. He sits down and pours liquor on the front row. He's incredible. Mick Mars never moves. He stands in the same place because he's got a back disorder and he's older than the rest of them and he can't move well. He stands in one place and plays better than 99% of guitar players you're going to find. But it's hard to find a live performance like a Mötley Crüe live performance.
All right, Bennett, tell me about some live performances from Guns N' Roses. Berkeley for us.
For your convenience and our listeners' convenience, I've composed a timeline of some of the more important dates that I think really highlight what a Guns N' Roses live performance is like. First one would be in where else but Los Angeles, June 6th of 1985. This would be the night that would pretty much change the lives of these 5 members of Guns N' Roses. It'd be the first time that all 5 original members would perform together as the name Guns N' Roses. The people in attendance were said to go crazy as they took the stage. And fast forward to 2 hours after they took the stage, they knew that they were doing something really special. It's kind of the birth of a new rock era. And should this not happen for one reason or another, maybe there's a chance that the whole history book of rock and roll is written differently than what we have now. The venue that they were at is the Troubadour in Western Hollywood. And this remains a venue that's still very close to the hearts of these original members of the band. And you can even, there's proof of that. You can go online now to the Guns N' Roses website and go to their merch store, and you can actually purchase Troubadour themed T-shirts that does show just how much that first venue meant to this group and everything. So I thought that was definitely worth mentioning. Now, move along a couple years. November 22nd, 1987, after allegedly witnessing a security guard shoving a friend of his, Axl Rose jumped into the crowd at an Atlanta show and punched the guard in the face. And so Axl Rose he's getting hauled off stage and arrested. And so what does his bandmates do? They have to do something. They can't just leave. So they go the rest of the show entertaining the crowd by playing Led Zeppelin and Rolling Stones covers because they have nobody to sing because he's done been hauled off for freaking punching a security guard. A few months later, November 2nd, 1988, this concert was aired frequently on MTV, and it kind of served as kind of as the introduction to a live Guns N' Roses experience. And luckily, the cameras captured a great show from the New York Ritz's. It was highlighted particularly impressive by a version of Paradise City that saw Axl Rose risk his life and limbs by diving into the crowd. And kind of, as it said, the security was kind of lax, and Axel had something to say about the security of that show, but I cannot repeat it. But it's there. It's there to look up if you want to type it into your Google machine. But he didn't have kind words to say after diving into the crowd about security. Anywho, August 20th, same year, the show is at the Monsters of Rocks Fest in England, and it's remembered for probably the worst possible reason. Despite Axl Rose's best attempt to convince the 100,000 plus strong crowd to calm down, kind of settle down, they were a little bit too rowdy, and there was a trampling surge kind of towards the stage that actually trampled two people and killed them. So two people were trampled to death by this really rowdy group of fans. The band was blamed for this incident, and by of course the media, people of the media, they blamed them for this unfortunate death of these two people. But the head of the festival's security, they actually defended Guns N' Roses, and because they had to cut their performance short when things just got way too out of control. And afterwards, this is when the media would go on to dub Guns N' Roses as the most dangerous band in the world. So things got a little bit out of hand in England there.
Okay.
September 8th of '89. This would be the only actual Guns N' Roses performance at the MTV Video Music Awards. And Axl Rose joined Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers for a 2-song set. But this would not be the showstopper of the evening. It was actually Easy Stradlin who stole the headlines when he got punched in the face by none other than Vince Neil of Mötley Crüe, who was apparently mad about something that Stradlin may or may have not done with his wife. Axel would then later accuse Neil of punching like a powder puff and offered to stand in for his bandmate in any kind of future rematches that they may have had. So a little bit of bad blood between these two bands here that we're talking about. June 2nd, '91. After jumping into the crowd from apparently somebody that was taking unauthorized photos, Axl Rose left the stage in St. Louis Riverport Amphitheater early, and this resulted in a crowd riot that injured dozens of fans and it got Guns N' Roses banned for life from the city of St. Louis, and all because he got mad because of somebody taking unauthorized photos of him. Just pandemonium broke out. Flash forward just a little bit, November 27th of 91, just to kind of display how by 91 how deeply that Guns N' Roses had become kind of ingrained in mainstream and the culture. Slash joined the stage with Michael Jackson during one of Michael Jackson's MTV performances on their 10th anniversary special, and Slash and Michael Jackson kind of joined a friendship on that. It's kind of an unlikely friendship, but them two would go on to do several songs together in the studios as well. So Slash and Michael Jackson, big friends. Who would have knew?
Who knew?
August 8th, 92, Metallica and Guns N' Roses were in Montreal. This is a big one. This is known as I think it's called the Montreal disaster, Montreal controversy, something like that. You can Google it. But you got Metallica and you got Guns N' Roses, two huge bands by 92. And they're in Montreal. I think Montreal, we can blame Montreal for this. They ruin everything. But there's this huge concert, but things went awry in a hurry for the entire show. The pyrotechnics kind of had a little mishap for Metallica, so they had to cut their set short, and so the crowd was mad about that. Then the crowd had to wait nearly 2 hours for Guns N' Roses to take the stage, and then unfortunately there was problems with the monitors, and Axl Rose had some vocal cord issues going on too, which caused them to end their show early as well. So the people in Montreal went on to riot, and they actually flipped a police car, and it made headlines worldwide for this disaster of a concert that happened because of just everything went wrong that could possibly go wrong. Very last one, September 9th, 1992. This is a big one for me. So 3 years after the little scuffle they had with Crüe at the VMAs, Guns N' Roses kind of traded words back and forth with Nirvana in 92. Reportedly, Axl Rose had responded to Kurt Cobain's sarcastic backstage kind of jab to request to serve as his child's godfather. And Axl didn't really care for this little sarcastic remark that he made. So then he threatened to, quote, take the Smells Like Teen Spirit rider to the pavement if he ever, talked like that again to him. And this is just kind of like a small sample of Guns N' Roses. You've got everything from performing with Michael Jackson to all these debacles on stage. And they're actually very, very notorious for being extremely late to shows. It would be very common for them to be like an hour and a half late to get on stage just because they didn't care. This is kind of what made Guns N' Roses. They had a reputation for their shows to be kind of wild, kind of raunchy, and very unpredictable. And they did things their way, and they didn't care what anybody else thought or said. And to me, that pretty well sums up what a 80s rock and roll band should be like, really.
All right. Final topic tonight. Tell me about the legacy and impact for Mötley Crüe.
I said in the opening statement that Mötley Crüe defined and redefined sex, drugs, rock and roll. And I think that's exactly what Mötley Crüe's legacy is. And you can break that down into all three aspects. You look at sex. Look at Tommy Lee. Tommy Lee was married to Heather Locklear in the 80s, who is hot now. She was very hot then. Um, but he had multiple addictions, one of which included women, which ended that relationship. He had a famous video, homemade video, I guess we could say, with his wife. I don't know that she was his wife when it was shot, but Pamela Anderson, who was the hottest woman in the world for the longest time. Tommy Lee said about meeting Pamela Anderson, on Ecstasy, Joan Rivers looks like Pamela Anderson. So imagine what Pamela Anderson looked like. Uh, so, uh, but there was all kinds of women involved with Mötley Crüe. Tommy, at one point early on in their career, had a fiance that Nikki Sixx, not knowing who she was, hooked up with her backstage. And then their manager said something to the effect of, well, I see you met Tommy's girlfriend. Turns out she was actually Tommy's fiance at the time. Vince Neil hooked up with the Elektra Records, their record label at the time. Their representative brought his girlfriend to a Mötley Crüe show, and she ended up hooking up with Vince Neil backstage. In a famed line in the movie The Dirt, the Elektra representative said was, the bottom line is, don't leave your girlfriend alone with Mötley Crüe. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Drugs is very key in the story of Mötley Crüe. They had a famed rundown apartment in LA when they first got together that became the scene of these huge, outrageous parties. Constant partying. That first record deal they got with Elektra Records, they got advanced a ton of money and spent that ton of money all on drugs and booze. There's a famous story of at that apartment, David Lee Roth of Van Halen was at one of these crappy apartment parties. It's in Tommy Lee's book. He talks about David Lee Roth sitting there doing a bump of cocaine and a mirror falling off the wall and breaking over his head and him not even noticing. He was that screwed up. But the drugs weren't always fun and games. The alcohol, the booze wasn't always fun and games. 1984, Vince Neil hosted a party at his house and left with Razzle Dingley, who was the drummer for Hanoi Rocks. They were going to go to the liquor store. And Axl Rose crashed his car, or Axl Rose, Vince Neil actually crashed his car, and Razzle Dingley died in that car crash. Vince Neil was charged with drunk driving and manslaughter, and actually did 30 days, was supposed to serve 30 days in jail, but did 18 if he promised to stay sober. There was a lot of controversy over that. Is it because he's the front man of Mötley Crüe? He killed a guy and only got 18 days in jail. And he definitely didn't live up to that promise to stay sober. Another car crash probably sparked the biggest addiction of the group. Recording their second album, Nikki Sixx was in a car crash after he drunkenly stole his friend's Porsche in LA and wrecked it. He got hurt pretty bad, but he had a drinking problem. And his friend, name drop here, Demi Moore, actually tried to convince Nikki Sixx to go to AA, and he refused to do so. And he ends up in this crash, badly hurt his shoulder, and he was prescribed Percocet as a kind of short-term fix. It's commonly prescribed as a short-term fix, but his use of Percocet transitioned him directly to a crippling addiction with heroin, which at one point cost him $3,500 a day he was spending on heroin. And as I mentioned earlier, on a very notable day in the history of our world, December 23rd, 1987, a great man was born, and he's speaking to you right now. And a great man died that day. Nikki Sixx overdosed and literally was dead uh, for about 15 minutes.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Are you saying that you were reincarnated, half reincarnated of Nikki Sixx?
I've said this for years. I thought we were friends. I know I've said this to you at some point, but that was when Nikki Sixx died, and was the EMT was a Mötley Crüe fan and stabbed him in the heart twice. It took 2 shots of adrenaline um, to revive him. So, sex, drugs, both prevalent, and then rock and roll. Their legacy, the rock and roll, the anti-establishment, the doing what they wanted. They were the most destructive band in history. At one point, Doc McGee was their manager. Now, for those that don't know who Doc McGee is, he's a famous rock and roll manager. He managed Bon Jovi, he managed Kiss, and he managed Mötley Crüe during this time. Couple of quotes from Doc McGee. The first one is, I've already spent 10 years of my life apologizing for that band. As their manager, that's all I really did, apologize. For years afterward, I'd walk into a hotel lobby and the receptionist would call to me, Mr. McGee, and I'd run up and drop to my knees and say, oh, Jesus, I'm really sorry. They'd look at me funny and say, no, nothing's wrong. You have a telephone call. And I'd breathe a sigh of relief and thank the good Lord above that I wasn't managing Mötley Crüe anymore. And another quote from him says, I've managed the Scorpions, Bon Jovi, Skid Row, Kiss. I've been dragged through the deepest crap with all kinds of mentally ill people, but I have never been through what Mötley Crüe put me through. The wild lifestyle, it is rock and roll, because at the end of the day, they tore the roof off. They tore the roof off of clubs to make their name. They tore the roof off of arenas to become who they were. They had fun on stage, as messed up as they were. Another funny story real quick that I read several years ago in Tommy Lee's book. It was a time when Vince Neil wasn't in the band. There was a time where Vince Neil left and John Corabi was the lead singer, but they were, before a concert, the curtain's up, people can't see the stage, and there's music playing in the arena leading into before the band starts. There's music over the loudspeakers. They were on a tour and they were in Hiroshima, Japan. And they were already on stage, but the crowd couldn't see them. The curtain was up, but the lights were about to go out. And Tommy Lee just starts giggling and laughing hysterically. And Nikki Sixx says, Tommy, what is so funny? And he said, you just wait. The song before they turned the lights out and the show started that night was You Dropped a Bomb on Me. They were in Hiroshima, Japan, at Tommy Lee's request. Tommy Lee said about the band, we were always about the rebellion at the heart of America, not only because we lived that way, but also because rock and roll has always been salvation for horny, aggressive teenagers, as much as it's always been nothing but a bleeping racket to their parents. Our image, our attitude, and our message was an anti-authority, pro-shock, and indulgent as you could get. It didn't hurt that we looked insane, that we were insane, and that all of us separately and especially together were trouble magnets. At the end of the day, the legacy of Mötley Crüe is still being written because they're back. They went hard through 2015 and they retired, signed legal documents, a cessation of touring agreement, and they signed legal documents that they would never tour as Mötley Crüe again. Fast forward to 2020, they release their movie, The Dirt, on Netflix, and it becomes widely popular. And Mr. Elrod, there are loopholes in all legal agreements. And they got set to go on their first ever stadium tour with Def Leppard, Poison, Joan Jett opening. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has hit this year, and that tour has been postponed until next year. But their story's still being written. They are New York Times bestselling author. They wrote The Dirt as a band. Tommy Lee has a book. Nikki Sixx, when he was addicted to heroin, kept a diary and released that called The Heroin Diaries. And Vince Neils wrote a book. They have 4 New York Times bestsellers, which isn't very rock and roll. But at the end of the day, their impact is unquestioned and their legacy is still being written.
All right, Bennett, bring us home. Tell me about the legacy and impact for Guns N' Roses.
Well, it kind of sounds a little cliche, so forgive me, but in a lot of ways, Guns N' Roses really changed the world of music. Got a few points to hit on real quick as to back up this statement. Number one, they made Gibson guitars actually cool again. If you think at the time in the 80s, you had the rock and roll scene. It was full of glam, it was full of glitz. You had the brightly colored guitars, like the neon colored guitars, and they were in all those like very bold and angular abstract shapes at the time. But that wasn't really Guns N' Roses style. And Slash and Stradlin, they preferred more of the look and the sound of the Gibson Les Paul guitars. And once a lot of musicians saw them rocking the Gibsons, a lot of musicians kind of started following suit, especially a lot of up and coming musicians that also came out of the LA scene later on down the road. Um, like I've touched on a little bit, they didn't really go for the full on glam or the full on hairband scene. Okay, Axel, he kind of had a little bit of the hair metal band scene going on, but for the most part, if you look at the band, they all pretty much look like they just woken up from a wild party the night before, not before, and I think their popularity and their looks kind of helped get away from a lot of people ditching that pretty boy glam look that a lot of bands had going on. And one specific example I have would be like Poison, where kind of after Guns N' Roses came around, whether it be because of them or not, they kind of ditched the eyeliner and the makeup, and they kind of started going for more of a 5 o'clock shadow stubble look as opposed to their pretty boy glam look that they had going on kind of before Guns N' Roses hit the stage there. You've got songs like Sweet Child of Mine that really gave new life to power ballads. You've got, if you look at the 80s, you've got a ton of just like sappy love songs that bands put out that they really just geared towards ladies. There wasn't a whole lot of substance behind the song. It was just there like okay, yeah, we got to put out a ballad because everybody else is. So here's a little cheap ballad that's not really anything great. But Guns N' Roses, they took that and they proved that you can make a love song and you can make it as sappy as you want, but you can still rock out in the process. And speaking of Sweet Child of Mine, that song could possibly be one of the most covered songs of all time. Think about it. We've got the extremely awful cover that Sheryl Crow did of this song. That almost ruined one of my favorite movies, and that's Big Daddy. She tried to ruin that for me. Um, you've got another one of my favorite movies, Step Brothers, and there's this funny scene where Brennan's older brother Derek and his family are in the car, and they start singing "Sweet Child of Mine" a cappella. And of course, you got the little kids in the back, and Derek's like, "All right, Tommy, you're the oldest. I'm depending on you." And so he sings, and then after he does his whole verse. Derek's like, great vibrato, I'm proud of you. Then he's like, all right, Alice, go. And she's like, and he's like, you're flat, you're flat. What are you doing right now? I don't even know what you're doing. He's like, you don't even look good singing right now. He's like, I pay $1,200 a week for vocal lessons, and this is what you give me. And then he's like, I'm gonna have to save it with the solo. And he's like, bow, wow, wow, I'm Derek, and I can sing high like this. So you've got two can't go wrong with Guns N' Roses. Another more kind of get back more of a serious note. I touched on this before, but I think what Guns N' Roses did and how they come out just kind of guns blazing, it really forced other bands to kind of up their game. And one example would be Mötley Crüe. Like no diss at them whatsoever, but for much of the night, for the 80s, Mötley Crüe was like the undisputed, bad boy rock and roll. They had the whole bad boy image thing down. But when Appetite Destruction came out, it forced all these other bands to kind of meet that bar that Guns N' Roses set. And I think that us music lovers and people that appreciate music, we're the ones that benefited from this, because it made bands kind of come back and like, okay, well, we need to up our game. So then you get Dr. Feelgood out of Mötley Crüe after this, which is arguably one of their best albums. I feel like when they heard Guns N' Roses, they came back out swinging, and a lot of other bands came back out swinging. Like, we're not going to get one up by these new guys. So my final point I want to make is, it's one, y'all have to bear with me on this one, but it makes sense when you think about it. They opened the door for probably my favorite band, Nirvana, and other grunge bands to really take over the music scene in early 90s. If you go back and listen to our Nirvana versus Alice in Chains episode, it's widely accepted that Nirvana was on the forefront of the grunge movement. Also, Alice in Chains, they were on that forefront there that really killed, the 80s rock and roll, the hair band scene, all that. And even though that part is, I think, true, I think Guns N' Roses is kind of responsible for laying some of that groundwork down for that foundation for the grunge era. And that's because of their gritty, reality-based lyrics, and they were a little bit more real than kind of the silly stuff that we had for some of these other groups. They didn't do the hairspray and the spandex and all the shallow songs that we hear by comparison. So I think once that rock audiences kind of heard this more grittier, more down to earth side, like I talked about, wearing your heart on your sleeve, that type of stuff, they kind of wanted more of that kind of music. They were kind of done with the whole spandex era, and pretty much the hair metal days were numbered by then. And so then you usher in these groups like Nirvana, and grunge takes over from there. Even like today, Guns N' Roses has remained a huge part of the musical world. It's appeared in many movies, like I talked about with Big Daddy and Step Brothers. It's also been in a bunch of other. They've had songs in a bunch of other movies like Days of Thunder, Terminator 2, Interview with the Vampire, The Wrestler, and Rock of Ages, among the other ones too. Those are just the big ones. And if you think back to how many of us tried playing a Sweet Child of Mine on Guitar Hero 2 back in the mid 2000s, you try to play that opening riff, and it was like you only heard like 3 or 4 of the notes because the rest of the time you were missing them. It was like bang, 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 bang. I've got that just like embedded in my memory. If you do a quick search on YouTube, it shows that Sweet Child of Mine has been played 1.1 billion times on YouTube. Welcome to the Jungle has been played 410 million times, and November Rain is now up to 1.4 billion views. So, 3 decades after their debut, their music remains just as influential as it did back then in the 80s. They're an example of how a band can move rock forward. And sometimes you think, quote, how can you top anything by the Yardbirds or by Zeppelin or by the Stones? And then you hear Guns N' Roses and it's inspiring. You think that it's all been written, but it hasn't. And that came from Aerosmith's guitarist Joe Perry.
All right. I don't have any questions for you all tonight. This has been our longest episode so far. This has set a new record for this show.
On the distance.
So, for the sake of brevity here, 1 minute to each of you for your closing statements. I'm leaning a certain way, but let's see if one of y'all can convince me here. 1 minute, and who's up? Is it you, Bennett?
I think so. Can I do a minute 30?
Minute 30.
Okay, I think I can do it in a minute 30. Okay, here we go. Starting now, Tommy. Okay, several of these members of this band are considered among the best in their respective fields. You've got Rose, that's been called one of the best vocalists of all time. Slash is ranked one of the best guitar players of all time. He's one of the most famous and well-known musicians out there. I think even people that don't know so much about music, they know Slash. You even got people like McKagan that's been held as one of the best bass players in rock by publications ranging from Rolling Stones, Time, Guitar World, so have it. VH1 ranked Guns N' Roses 9th on its 100 Greatest Artists of Hard Rock, and also 32nd on its 100 Greatest Artists of All Time. Appetite for Destruction ranked 62nd Greatest Album of All Time by Rolling Stone magazine. Guns N' Roses were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2012 in their first year of eligibility. It's one of the world's best-selling bands of all time, having sold more than 100 million records worldwide, including 45 million just in the U.S. alone. The American Music Awards has given the band 4 awards, including Favorite Pop Rock Single for Sweet Child of Mine, both for Favorite Heavy Metal Hard Rock Artist and a Favorite Heavy Hard Rock Anthem album for Appetite Destruction. They've also had Grammy Awards like Mötley Crüe. I think they've also had 3 Grammy Award nominations, and they've won 4 MTV Music Awards. Now, there's many bands that you could consider when you talk about the greatest band of the 80s, but here's why I think Guns N' Roses is a pretty solid choice. They had quite possibly the greatest debut album of all time, as I've mentioned a few times before in this episode. They have one of the greatest all-around albums of all time, Appetite for Destruction. One more tick for me. Ting. And really, they weren't afraid to push the envelope with their songs. They've been best described as a band in whole as dark, sleazy, dirty, gritty, but then they've also been described as vulnerable, diverse, and honest, which to me is exactly everything that you want in hard rock music. And for those reasons and the reasons that we've talked about for the last 2.5 hours, I believe this is why Guns N' Roses is the greatest band to come from the 80s.
All right. So, Rhett, take us home. Mine's at Mötley Crüe.
When you think rock and roll, when you think that 80s hard rock metal scene, when you think sex, drugs, and rock and roll, there's an image in your head. There's a stereotype of what that is. There's something that defines what that is. That's Mötley Crüe. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll is 6 syllables that can be taken down to 3. Mötley Crüe. That is what they are. Not what they were. It's what they were in the 80s. It's what they still are now. They are the world's most notorious rock band from any era, much less the 80s. And I'm just going to close with this. It's the closing scene of The Dirt, which is their Netflix special based off their co authored biography that they all four wrote. And the last scene of that movie is them coming out of their dressing rooms, walking down the hallway to go to the stage. And there's a voiceover that's all four of their voices blended together. But the closing monologue goes like this. When Tommy sits down behind his drums, Nicky picks up his bass, and Mars plugs in his guitar, something happens, man. It's like a weird kind of electrical humidity. You don't just hear it, you feel it. All I can say is we effing made it, dude. I don't know how we're not dead or in jail. We crapped on a lot of people and did things we regret every day, and somehow we're still here in it together. That's fate. That's family. That's Motley effing Crüe.
Simple. I like it. My turn. This is how I scored this thing. In terms of albums, right? Do you dispute that Guns N' Roses had the best overall album?
For the purposes of this debate, yes.
If we were not debating, would you dispute that?
It's not my favorite of the albums between the two, but I mean, any numerical way you look at it, yeah.
I think, from what I've heard tonight, Mötley Crüe had a better collection of albums collectively. Would you agree with that, Bennett?
Yeah, they had a couple of songs on the GNR Lives, and that's really about it. Other than that, they're going into the early '90s, and then that's kind of when you're starting to see the grunge scene take over.
I think in terms of numbers of singles that resonate with the public, I think Guns N' Roses clearly has a better set that it's more commercially known. Wouldn't you agree with that, right?
Probably. And this won't help my side of the argument, but between these two bands, there's zero doubt I'm a Mötley Crüe guy. I don't think that definitely doesn't shock either one of you two, but it shouldn't shock anybody. I'm a Crüe guy, but between these two bands, my favorite song between these two bands, November Rain. It's a masterpiece.
But if I want to go see one of these bands, based on what I've heard tonight, I want to see Mötley Crüe because I want to see the band members get down and start slurping some ants with straws on the stage. That's what I want to see. It sounds like maybe Guns N' Roses doesn't care as much about the experience with the fans that the Mötley Crüe folks put on, right? Wouldn't you agree with that? If they're showing up 2 hours late?
There's a good chance that they're going to be late, and then one of them's going to get like thrown off the stage or arrested or something. So there's a really good chance you won't get a full concert out of it, really.
I think if you look at it on the whole, I think the better band, the better 80s band, when you look at the album sales, when you look at singles, when you look at who had the better album, it's got to be Guns N' Roses. So that's who I'm going with tonight. Guns N' Roses.
Interesting.
I respectfully disagree.
Yeah.
I will be appealing to a higher court.
Obviously going to be the appeals court judge.
Ants, man.
100% transparency now that it's said and done. I'm more of a Crüe guy than a Guns N' Roses guy. Just me personally, but I've never seen Guns N' Roses, live like I have Crüe. But yeah, Guns N' Roses has some pretty huge commercial songs, but I don't know. It's hard to beat Wild Side for me.
I didn't even mention Wild Side. Here's
That's
my
my
beef.
favorite.
Here's my beef with Guns N' Roses. For a lot of years, I wanted to see Guns N' Roses, and I wanted Guns N' Roses to get back together because they had broken up. But oddly enough, I went to an Ozzy Osbourne concert several years ago, and the opening act was Slash, with his band, which consisted of Miles Kennedy as the lead vocalist. Miles Kennedy, formerly of Alter Bridge, the most underrated vocalist maybe ever in the history of the world. And I heard him sing Guns N' Roses songs, and all of a sudden I didn't want Guns N' Roses to get back together because I felt like Miles Kennedy sang the songs better than Axl Rose.
I had, of course, Guns N' Roses is still around, but they're a shell of what the original five were. I came up with a really good analogy while I was trying to wrap my head around Guns N' Roses, and I've come up with the conclusion that you can describe Guns N' Roses as like a big, huge, expensive firework. It took them a minute for it to take off, and then whenever it did take off and it exploded, it was amazing. It was something spectacular to watch, but it didn't last very long. But you appreciated the huge firework that you got for that short time. It's the best
And,
analogy I could find.
and Mötley Crüe is an eternal flame.
Oh gosh. Take
Oh,
us home,
boy.
Rut.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for sticking with us this long. We appreciate both of you. Um, yeah, this went a lot longer. We're going to get better about that. And we're going to get better about that next week. And for once at the end of this show, I have an announcement to tell you about what next show is going to be because we actually have it laid out. Next week is Halloween week. This week we hit Rock-tober. Next week we're going to the movies. We're going to go over some horror movies. And I'm not mediating. Bennett's not mediating. And neither is Elrod. We're going to bring in a special guest yet again. We haven't 1,000% locked them down yet, so I won't announce any names. But we're looking at horror movie franchises, and it's going to be Freddy Krueger versus Jason versus Michael Myers. Not Austin Powers, the other one. That's coming for you next week. We actually already have the next couple weeks lined up, but I have a child coming at any point, so hopefully that doesn't mess up our plans. We're going to try to make sure it doesn't. I won't keep you guys any longer. Thanks for sticking with us. On behalf of Mr. Bennett, on behalf of Mr. Elrod, thanks for joining us. Come join us next week to find out the greatest horror movie franchise of all time. And until then, peace. Rock on.